They say that in the golden age of Hollywood, a man's face was his destiny. For some, it was a passport to romance and adventure. For others, it was a life sentence to the shadows. But for one man, a short, stocky gentleman with a voice like gravel grinding against velvet, his face was a mask that hid one of the most sophisticated minds in the history of the silver screen. Before we pull back the curtain on the enigma of Edward G. Robinson, I have to ask, where are you joining us from today? It's a privilege to share these corridors of history with enthusiasts from all over the globe. If you value the preservation of these cinematic legacies, please join our circle, subscribe to this channel, and help us keep the flame of classic Hollywood burning. We need your presence here to ensure these stories aren't buried by time. The year was 1944. If you walked into a darkened theater that autumn, you would have seen a masterpiece unfolding, Double Indemnity, a film that defined the very essence of noir. In it, Edward G. Robinson played Barton Keyes, a man who hunted the truth with the precision of a surgeon. But the man behind the claims adjuster was far more complex than the roles he inhabited. Most people saw a gangster, a tough guy, a product of the Lower East Side. They saw Little Caesar. What they didn't see was the polyglot, the aesthete, and the man who lived in a state of constant, yet quiet rebellion against the very industry that made him a star. Did you know that the toughest man in Hollywood didn't even start his life as Edward G. Robinson? He was born Emanuel Goldenberg in Bucharest, Romania. He wasn't running from the law. He was running from a far more terrifying reality, the rising tide of intolerance in Eastern Europe. When his family arrived at Ellis Island, they brought with them the hopes of 1,000 years and the refined culture of the Old World. Yet young Emanuel didn't just learn English, he mastered it. By the time he reached adulthood, he was fluent in 7 languages. Think about that for a moment. While he was playing thugs who could barely string a sentence together without a threat, he was actually a man who could discuss philosophy in French, German, and Yiddish. This intellectual depth created a profound friction in his career. In 1944, at the height of his powers, Robinson was a man living a double life. On the set, he was the personification of American grit. At home, he was surrounded by one of the most exquisite private art collections in the world. He didn't just buy paintings, he understood them. He lived with them. He once famously said that he didn't collect art, but that the art allowed him to stay in its presence. Imagine the scene. A man who just spent 12 hours screaming orders at a mob on a backlot, returning home to spend his evening in silent contemplation of a Van Gogh or a Renoir. It's a contrast that would baffle the average moviegoer of the time, yet it was the very fuel that powered his performances. But there was a darker side to this sophistication, a secret he guarded with the intensity of a state secret. Despite being the face of the cinematic underworld, Edward G. Robinson had a visceral, physical aversion to violence. Specifically, he had a paralyzing fear of guns. It's the ultimate irony of his career. And the man who popularized the image of the Tommy gun-toting racketeer was so terrified of the noise and the recoil that he couldn't keep his eyes open when firing. If you look closely at his early films, you'll notice a strange quirk. Whenever his character pulls the trigger, his eyes are squeezed shut. In the 1944 era, he had to train himself through sheer willpower and a bit of Hollywood magic, sometimes even using transparent tape on his eyelids, just to maintain the illusion of a cold-blooded killer. He was an actor of such caliber that he convinced the world he was a predator, while his very soul recoiled at the tools of the trade. The industry, however, didn't care about his soul. They cared about the box office. By the mid-40s, the tough guy trope was beginning to feel like a cage. Moy Robinson was desperate to break free, to show the world the man of culture he truly was. This led to a series of choices that would eventually place him in the crosshairs of a much more dangerous enemy than any cinematic rival. You see, being an intellectual in Hollywood during the 1940s was a double-edged sword. It meant you had opinions. It meant you read books that others found suspicious. And in an era where the political winds were beginning to shift toward a chilling frost, it being well-read was often synonymous with being subversive. He was a man of immense generosity, often using his wealth to support causes he believed were just. But in the corridors of power, generosity is often mistaken for a hidden agenda. As 1944 drew to a close, Robinson was unknowingly stepping into a trap. He was a man who believed in the American dream because he had lived it, but he was about to find out that the dream had a gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper was starting to keep a list. Yet he felt secure in his status, a titan of the screen, a respected member of the elite. Yet the very things that made him unique, his heritage, his languages, his passion for foreign art, were being compiled into a dossier that would later threaten to dismantle everything he had built. It's often said that the most dangerous thing you can be is a man who knows too much and says too little. Robinson fit that description perfectly. He walked the streets of Los Angeles with a quiet dignity, often mistaken for arrogance. He wasn't arrogant, he was simply existing on a different frequency. While his peers were chasing the next starlet or the next drink, he was attending lectures and corresponding with thinkers. This isolation, this intellectual solitude, made him a target. People don't like what they can't understand, and they certainly didn't understand how a man who looked like a pugilist could think like a poet. As we move deeper into his story, as we begin to see the cracks in the facade, the transition from the 30s gangster to the 40s intellectual hero wasn't just a career move. It was a desperate attempt to align his public image with his private reality. But as any student of the noir genre knows, you can't outrun your past. The Little Caesar persona was a ghost that followed him into every room, every gallery, and every political meeting. It was a shadow that grew longer as the sun began to set on the pre-war era. And then, there was the matter of his personal life, a realm where even his vast intelligence couldn't protect him from the complexities of the human heart. His marriage, his relationship with his son, and the immense pressure of maintaining a household that was essentially a private museum. All of these elements were converging into a storm. He was a man who craved stability, yet he worked in an industry built on smoke and mirrors. He was a man who valued truth, yet he made his living telling lies. But perhaps the most intriguing fact of all, and one that few people realize even today, is how much he actually contributed to the war effort behind the scenes. He didn't just sell bonds. He used his linguistic skills in ways that were never fully publicized, acting as a bridge between cultures when the world was tearing itself apart. He was a patriot who was eventually treated like a pariah. Yes, and that's where the story takes a turn that sounds like a script from the very films he starred in, a tale of betrayal, sacrifice, and a man forced to choose between his principles and his survival. We are just scratching the surface of the man who was Edward G. Robinson, the sophisticated collector, the reluctant gunman, the man of 7 tongues. But the most revealing chapter is yet to come. It involves a betrayal so deep it changed the course of his life forever, and a loss so personal it nearly broke his spirit. You might think you know the ending to this story, but in the world of noir, the ending is never what it seems. The shadows are getting longer, and we are about to enter the most controversial decade of his life, a time when the studio lights dimmed and the harsh glare of an interrogation room took their place. But before we go there, we need to talk about what happened on the set of The Woman in the Window and why that film marked the beginning of a very real nightmare for Robinson, a nightmare that would eventually cost him his most prized possessions. The year 1944 wasn't just a peak for Edward G. Robinson, it was a precipice. While the world watched him play the brilliant insurance investigator in Double Indemnity, a man who could sniff out a lie from a mile away, Robinson himself was beginning to feel the walls of Hollywood closing in. You see, there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the smartest person in the room, especially when that room is a film studio. He was a man who preferred the company of philosophers and painters, yet his public image was tethered to the gutter, to the street tough, and to the criminal underworld. This disconnect wasn't just a matter of ego, it was a psychological weight that he carried into every scene. But here is a detail that almost nobody talks about: the physical toll of being a tough guy when your nature is anything but. Robinson suffered from a recurring internal conflict that manifested in his health. During the filming of some of his most intense scenes in the mid-40s, he struggled with severe bouts of anxiety. The irony is staggering. Here was a man who looked like he could chew nails, yet he was often found in his dressing room, surrounded by books on Renaissance art, yet trying to calm his racing heart before he had to go back out and bark at his co-stars. He was an actor of such immense craft that he manufactured a persona of steel out of a soul made of silk. This brings us to one of the most guarded aspects of his life during this era, his involvement with the Free World Association. While other stars were attending lavish parties at Ciro's or the Mocambo, Robinson was using his linguistic mastery to translate broadcasts for the Office of War Information. Oh, he was a man who understood the power of the word. He spoke to Europe in their own tongues, pleading for resistance against the darkness of the time. But in Hollywood, this kind of intellectual activism was viewed with a squinted eye. To the studio bosses, he was a difficult asset. To the burgeoning political investigators, he was a person of interest. They couldn't understand why a man with a multi-million-dollar art collection and a mansion in Beverly Hills would care so much about the struggles of the working man in distant lands. And then there was the art, the famous G. Robinson collection. By 1944, it was more than just a hobby. It was his sanctuary. But even sanctuaries have a price. He once spent a small fortune on a single painting, while the rest of the country was rationing sugar and gasoline. Yes, he didn't do it out of greed, but out of a desperate need to surround himself with beauty in a world that he felt was becoming increasingly ugly. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, but telling nonetheless, that he would sometimes talk to his paintings when the pressures of the studio became too much. He treated the figures in the canvases of Renoir and Cézanne as his true peers, the only ones who didn't expect him to pull a gun or snarl a threat. Oh, but let's talk about the dark mirror of his life. In 1944, he starred in The Woman in the Window, directed by the legendary Fritz Lang. Lang was a man of shadows, a director who understood the mechanical cruelty of fate. Working with Lang pushed Robinson to a breaking point. Lang was notorious for his repetitive, grueling style, sometimes demanding dozens of takes for a single movement. For Robinson, who valued the intellectual click of a character, this was torture. It was during this production that the mask began to slip. People on set noticed that the tough guy was becoming increasingly fragile. He was portraying a man caught in a web of his own making, and the lines between the script and his reality were starting to blur. He felt the eyes of the industry on him, not just as a star, but as a target. You see, 1944 was also the year that the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals was formed. Oh, it was the precursor to the dark days of the Blacklist. Robinson, with his sophisticated European roots and his outspoken support for diverse causes, was high on their list of un-American types. He was too cultured for his own good. He was a man who could see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon long before anyone else. He knew that the very country that had welcomed him as a refugee was beginning to look at him with suspicion. Yet, he didn't back down. That was the Robinson grit. It wasn't the grit of a gangster. It was the grit of a scholar. He continued to host salons at his home, bringing together writers, scientists, and artists. He was building a fortress of culture, unaware that the gates were already being undermined. There is a certain tragedy in seeing a man of such high intellect believe that logic and truth would be enough to protect him from the irrationality of political fervor. He thought his talent was his shield. He was wrong. And there is also the matter of his son, Manny. Robinson was a man who deeply valued the idea of a legacy, of passing down his refined tastes and his hard-earned wisdom. But the pressure of being the son of Little Caesar was immense. While Robinson was trying to cultivate a world of art and intellect, his domestic life was becoming a theater of conflict. The man who could command an audience of millions often found himself powerless in his own living room. It's a classic noir theme. The man who conquers the world but loses his own home. He was surrounded by masterpieces on the walls, but the silence between the frames was deafening. Perhaps the most hidden fact of this period was Robinson's secret struggle with his own image. He hated looking at himself on screen. He found his own face to be a clumsy tool, as he once described it. He wanted the grace of a Valentino or the ruggedness of a Gable. Instead, he had the face of a man who had seen too much. He used this insecurity to fuel his performances, turning his self-loathing into a raw, magnetic energy that the camera adored. He was a man who felt like a fraud in a tuxedo, even though he was the only one in the room who truly understood the history of the fabric. As we move into the late 40s, we see the beginning of the end for the first chapter of his life. It's the transition from the respected elder statesman of noir to the suspect was swift and brutal. But before the subpoenas arrived, there was one final moment of glory, a moment where he stood at the center of the cinematic universe, seemingly untouchable. It was a moment of pure illusion, the kind that only Hollywood can create. He was at the top of the mountain, but the ground beneath him was made of shifting sand. What happened next is a sequence of events that most Hollywood historians prefer to gloss over. It involves a forced sale, a public humiliation, and a betrayal by those he considered his closest allies. But there is a detail, a specific meeting in a smoke-filled room that changed everything. A meeting where Edward G. Robinson was told exactly what it would cost to keep his career, and the price wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in names. He was a man of 7 languages. But in that moment, he found himself speechless. The man who had played heroes and villains alike was now forced to play a role he despised, the victim. But as we will see, Robinson was never truly a victim. He was a survivor, a man who knew that even when you lose the collection, you keep the eye for beauty. Even when you lose the career, you keep the voice. But the most disturbing part of this entire saga isn't what he lost. It's what he had to do to get a fraction of it back. And that's a story that involves a very specific set of documents and a cold, hard look in the mirror that lasted for years. You think you know the price of fame? You haven't seen the bill that was handed to Edward G. Robinson. And speaking of bills, there was one particular painting, a masterpiece by a world-renowned artist, that became the symbol of his downfall. A painting he refused to let go of. It's until the very law he had spent a career portraying came knocking at his door with a different kind of authority, but that's a revelation for the next chapter of our journey. The late 1940s and early 50s were a time of shadows, not just in the movies, but in the very streets of Los Angeles. For Edward G. Robinson, the man who spoke 7 languages, the world was suddenly speaking a language he couldn't understand, the language of betrayal. You see, yet the same intellectual curiosity that made him a legend, his desire to help the displaced, his support for civil rights, his presence at rallies for the common man, was now being weaponized against him. The FBI had a file on him that was growing thicker by the day. They didn't see a great actor, they saw a dangerous intellectual with foreign roots. But here is the fact that will disturb you. Robinson was one of the few stars who tried to fight back with logic. He went to Washington, D.C., and not once but several times, voluntarily. He wanted to look his accusers in the eye. He believed that in America, a man's character and his contributions to the war effort would outweigh the whispers of nameless informants. He was wrong. In the era of the Blacklist, logic was the first casualty. He found himself in a surreal nightmare where he had to prove a negative, that he wasn't a threat to the country he loved with all his soul. This pressure began to erode the very foundation of his life. While he was fighting for his reputation in the halls of power, his sanctuary at home was crumbling. His marriage to Gladys Lloyd, which had lasted decades, was dissolving into a bitter, public, and financially devastating divorce. And this is where the story gets truly heavy. Because Gladys had been a partner in building his legendary art collection, the court ruled that the collection had to be sold to settle the divorce. Imagine the pain of a man who spent his life surrounding himself with beauty, Van Goghs, Gauguins, Picassos, only to be forced to watch them be auctioned off to the highest bidder. To Robinson, this wasn't just losing money, it was like losing his skin. He often said that those paintings were his children, In 1956, he sat in a room and watched his soul being sold piece by piece for over $3 million. A staggering sum at the time, but a pittance compared to what they meant to him. But there is a detail about that auction that most people miss. Even as he was losing everything, Robinson refused to lose his dignity. He sat in the front row. He watched every gavel fall. He didn't hide. He showed the world that you can take a man's possessions, but you cannot take his eye for greatness. However, the stress of the blacklist and the divorce took a physical toll. He suffered a massive heart attack during this period. The tough guy was literally breaking from the inside out. He was a man who had reached the pinnacle of Hollywood success, only to find himself alone in a hospital bed, his career in tatters, his house empty of art, and his name dragged through the mud. Did you know that during the height of his exile from the big studios, he was forced to take jobs that were far beneath his talent? The man who was the king of Warner Brothers was now working in low-budget B movies and even taking minor roles just to pay the bills. But here is the weird fact. He never gave a bad performance. Whether he was playing a king or a commoner in a cheap production, he brought the same intensity, the same seven-language deep intellect to every line. He was a craftsman who refused to let the industry's cruelty diminish his art. There was a moment, a very dark moment, where he was told that if he just gave the committee a few names, everything would go back to normal. He refused for as long as he could. But the tragedy of Edward G. Robinson is that he eventually had to make a compromise to survive. He didn't name names in the way others did, but he was forced to clear his name in a way that left a bitter taste in his mouth for the rest of his life. He felt he had betrayed himself. This is the true noir ending. The hero survives, but he is scarred. He is no longer the same man who walked onto the set of Double Indemnity with a cigar and a smile, but the most incredible transformation was still to come. In his 60s, when most actors were being put out to pasture, Robinson staged a comeback that is still studied in acting schools today. He didn't try to be the young gangster anymore. He embraced the role of the elder statesman. He became the moral compass of his films. He used his aging face, a face that now carried the genuine lines of grief and survival, to tell stories of human resilience. There is one specific story from the set of his final film, Soylent Green, that will stay with you. He was dying of cancer during the filming. Only his co-star and friend, Charlton Heston, knew the truth. In his final scene, a scene where his character chooses to leave this world, Robinson wasn't just acting, he was saying goodbye. He died only 12 days after the filming ended. He never got to see the final cut. He never got to hear the applause. But he died as he lived, working, thinking, and refusing to let the light fade without a fight. And here is the most ironic fact of all. Shortly after his death, he was awarded an honorary Oscar for his lifetime achievement. The very industry that had blacklisted him, the very system that had forced him to sell his art and defend his loyalty, finally decided to say thank you. It was a gesture that was both beautiful and hollow. He wasn't there to receive it. His wife accepted it on his behalf. But the legacy of Edward G. Robinson isn't found in a gold statue or a list of box office hits. It's found in the fact that he proved that a man can be more than one thing. You can be a gangster on screen and a gentleman off it. You can lose your fortune and keep your soul. You can be silenced by a committee but heard by history. He was the ultimate outsider who became the ultimate insider. A man who spoke 7 languages, but whose most powerful message was delivered in the silence between his lines. As we wrap up this journey, I want you to think about the collection you are building in your own life. Is it made of things, or is it made of character? Robinson lost the paintings, but he kept the man. And that, my friends, is the most important fact of all. If this story touched you, if you see the world of classic Hollywood a little differently now, please share this video. We are a small community, but we are a strong one. And don't forget to check out our next video, where we dive into the dark secrets of another legend who lived in the shadows of the 1940s. The story we have for you next involves a mystery that has remained unsolved for 80 years until now.